Now for Michelangelo. I will freely admit that he is my favorite. In fact, what you see in front of you is a photograph of a chalk drawing of his Last Judgment. One I found appeared on the sidewalk outside of Columbia University in New York City, and its twin appeared on the sidewalk outside Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So someone was going around decorating the Ivy League colleges with Christ from Michelangelo's famous Last Judgment. I think it's no secret why. Michelangelo, in many ways, defines the indefinable parts of Renaissance man. We have Leonardo, who is, the polymath, who is good at everything. Raphael, the young art star who dies before his time. And Michelangelo, the genius. So what is genius? What do Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo have in common as masters of the Renaissance? And if you know your Ninja Turtles, some people toss in Donatello as well. How do they view each other? There's a wonderful section in the book where we get to read Leonardo on art, on painting specifically, and Michelangelo writing about painting and sculpture as if responding, where Michelangelo describes painting and sculpture not in competition with each other, but two sides of the same coin, as I described with humanism and the sacred and the profane last time. He does take a little dig at Leonardo. My serving maid could have written better. And that kind of shows Michelangelo's personality. We have writing that suggests he was difficult to work with, and yet the Pope, the Medici patrons keep on commissioning artwork because of how good he is. He lives a long life through the High Renaissance to Mannerism. And it's his work in sculpture, in painting, and in architecture that really define High Renaissance for many people. And as we go on, we're going to contend in this course with why is it these artists, Raphael and Michelangelo especially, why is it this artwork from the Italian High Renaissance that are understood as the gold standard? Why is Mona Lisa the most famous painting in the world, just particularly the Western world? Why are we as Americans and people of European descent and all sorts of other immigrants collectively seen as the inheritors of this culture? Genius is defined as something innate, an innate ability. If you go back even further to its word origins, it refers to a companion spirit, almost like a guardian angel. The point is that it is a connection between that profane earthly world, the artist himself, and the sacred, divine inspiration, as Titian painted. So we have, as I said before, the development of the painter or the sculptor, the architect as genius, as divinely inspired in a way we haven't seen before in history, where all the other painters that have come before have just been master craftsmen. So here's Michelangelo Buonarroti, the sculptor, and this is how he would probably prefer to be seen. Sculpture remained his favorite technique, marble his favorite medium. His Pietà, commissioned by a French bishop, is still on display in Rome. And it's a perfect example of an artist lending his personal style to a very time-honored composition. Pietà, you might hear it in the word there, is meant to evoke pity, sympathy, sadness, grief for the dead Jesus as Mary holds him after the crucifixion. This is different from Mary and the child Jesus that we've seen before in many paintings. And I'm showing this one, Fouquet's in particular, because it too is a rather unique play on a conventional standard, mother and child, Mary and Jesus, with a little bit of a French twist, if you remember the deal with this one. Nothing too political is going on here. Nothing that is contextual necessarily. And that's where the genius part comes in. The uniqueness seems to come from Michelangelo himself. The monumentality of Mary. When you look, she's holding an adult man in her lap. So she herself is massive. Imagine her sitting, standing up from her position. She's not dainty or delicate and modeled after, the king's mistress, like Fouquet's Mary there. And there's no need for any abstract distortion for expression, as has been done in medieval versions of the same theme. This is a German Pietà from the 14th century, where not only is the wood carved to be very dramatic in terms of that tip of the head of Jesus and the sad kind of drooping face of Mary, but red paint actually decorates his wounds. All we have is bright polished marble on Michelangelo's Pietà, and sort of an outstretched left hand here of Mary. She is presenting him, look at what they've done to my son. So this in the chapel is very evocative, very emotional, without the red paint, without even detailing necessarily of the wounds themselves. Note, the hands, the feet are not as big a focal point in this composition as they are in the medieval version. What is seen, though, is the vitality, the monumentality and strength of Mary versus the limpness and the lightness of the body of Jesus. So it's almost as if Mary is the masculine one. Mary is the protector. Mary is the parent. And Jesus, the child, although adult, is the one who has been kind of sapped of that strength, that masculinity. In part, we can thank kind of a legendary discovery of this Hellenistic artwork, the Laocoon. I believe a legend has it, perhaps Vasari lays this out, Giorgio Vasari, the great Renaissance art historian, also written about in your book, that this is unearthed in the ruins of the Roman emperor's villa in front of Michelangelo's eyes. So the way that these ancient artists manipulate and deal with and change and alter the marble to become twisting bodies down to the murderous serpents, the very hair and furrowed brow and expression on Laocoon's face, a Trojan priest punished by the gods along with his sons. We can see that Michelangelo inherits this message of, I don't need color even. I don't need to point out the wounds. I need a face. I need a body to express, to send the message. So this is Michelangelo giving a truly humanist spin on a traditional Christian convention, the Pietà, because of the Roman and Greek art that he has seen in person, because of the way in which similar subject matter has been displayed in ancient and pagan contexts. So in a way here, this is Pietà versus Mantegna's foreshortened Christ. Without the usual toolkit of humanist painting, foreshortening, first and foremost, we have this wonderful expression in what ought to be very grand, and definitely at a grand scale, this marble sculpture. And yet it presents a very tender subject. And that is a little counter to what the book writes about, that idea of terribilità, that Michelangelo and his work are awesome and yet terrifying at the same time. This is an example of Michelangelo being quite in tune with human weakness, human grief. This is artwork that is not puzzling, right? It's not puzzling like Madonna of the Rocks. It's not enigmatic like Mona Lisa. It is quite simply a distortion or a change, if you will, of the female form to present this lovely dichotomy of mother and son, life and death. And you could even say masculine and feminine in terms of form, body form alone. So Michelangelo is not a stranger to distortion. In fact, there are elements of David here that are quite distorted. If you look at him close up, if you were able to, climb a ladder and actually stand beside his head, which it is a gigantic sculpture, a giant head, proportionally, you would notice that the head is too large for the torso. The hands are so much larger than the feet. And that is so when the photograph is taken this way, when we're looking at him from the floor, we perceive the proportions as visually pleasing, equal. Mathematically, they are distorted. He is top heavy. And yet to our eyes, that is done to accommodate the optical fact that something farther away will appear smaller. So David's head would have appeared smaller if Michelangelo had sculpted it exactly proportionally. So again, we have a classical figure imbued with emotion, adjusted to suit the perspective of the viewer. And this is a moment in a biblical story that is anticipation of a battle. If you're not familiar at all with David or with David and Goliath, this is before he becomes the great king of the Israelites. This is David the boy battling the gigantic soldier warrior of the Philistines with a slingshot. And once again, I've asked the question, do you really think someone would have gone to battle nude? Part of that is because of tradition set by Donatello, if you remember. Part of it is to show vulnerability. As a symbol of Florentine liberty, David, the figure, puts the city in the light of an underdog, of the one who shouldn't win. So when you're a David versus a Goliath, you're the little guy who is not expected to come out on top. Florence is the little guy versus the Pope in Rome and the King of France and anyone else who might try to invade. So the nudity is in part the influence of the classical, a humanist mode for sculpture now, and it suits the emotion set by Michelangelo's choice of episode in the story. Compare him to Donatello's work, and we have on the left a bronze that is much smaller in scale, much more human scaled, and set at the end of the story. Once David wins and decapitates Goliath, there he is standing on the head of the Philistine. So this is the boy, the victor. What we're looking at on the right-hand side is the boy clasping sling in left hand, stone in right hand, looking across the battlefield at the Goliath. And oh, I should have a much better view for you. One moment. If I can find it. Should be, there he is. Just a little glimpse here of the detail that Michelangelo is able to accomplish at such a large scale. The conservators who take care of this statue, they are literally dwarfed. They are up on ladders to reach this height, his eye and brow level. So that furrowed brow that we see, that deep set eye that Michelangelo would have had to actually drill into the marble instead of just chiseling, is looking across, and we kind of sense his anticipation. We sense his emotion. It's all in the face, though. Maybe a little bit in some tense muscles. There's nothing really in his pose that seems nervous, though. It's that contrapposto that we've come to expect from humanist sculptors, complete with details like fingernails, tendons, veins in his arms. It is the quintessential male nude. And Michelangelo's philosophy on that process of making marble into flesh is perhaps best described by Rebellious Captive Bound Slave here, where he's actually left parts uncarved. He writes that David and his work, like the Pietà, already exists inside the marble, and he just frees the artwork from its marble prison. He's just removing the excess, the extra, that prevents us from seeing the work. So he wouldn't probably say he's divinely inspired. He would say that he is just facilitating our ability to view. And the marble that he carves David out of was seen as impossible to work with because of its proportions. It was too long, too tall. But he made it work with his visual tricks, with the way that he presents the male nude, not in the usual way that we're used to, like from Donatello. So how does someone who thinks so philosophically about the act of carving out of marble, how does that person approach painting? Because Michelangelo, the painter, is busy with the Pope's chapel, the Sistine Chapel. He wanted to continue working on Julius's tomb, for which Bound Slave is one of his studies, and yet this is what we often remember him best for. This ceiling program is actually quite complicated, with Old Testament stories in the center. So all of these, each scene blocked apart, are stories from the book of Genesis in particular. There's New Testament on the wall that we'll see in a bit, no worries. But we have stories like the creation, the fall of Adam and Eve, and that would connect to the altar, which shows redemption. So basically the ceiling shows the original sin. It shows the need for redemption, and the altar at which the Pope and the cardinals would perform Mass is where we have the display of judgment and redemption. Surrounding these scenes are ancestors of Christ and prophets in these pendentives, these triangular sections, and occupying these very sculptural spaces in between are sibyls, historical classical women with the gift of sight, oracles who can predict the future, who are consulted by kings in classical tradition. That might be the part that seems a little out of place, but not when we actually zoom in and look at how Michelangelo has depicted the creation of Adam, for instance. The way he's worked with these bodies may seem very pagan. He's basically creating in pigment Roman sculpture. So God, Adam, Eve, everybody presents like Laocoon, like massive, heavy marble on the surface. And even the architectural framework that like Raphael, he's extended and used to fool our eyes into thinking of the ceiling as an extension of real space. All of that contributes to his overall program of a sculptural as opposed to pictorial space, using the human body just as in the Pietà to express. And that is important because we're looking at this from the floor of the Sistine Chapel. We're not going to be able to see every eyebrow, every eye movement and glance. So this is acted out for us, mimed for us, each story, each position, each attitude in a very concrete way. Again, that doesn't call for any puzzling out. So here's a less dizzy look at, on the left, one of the sibyls with At the top, scenes from Genesis and prophets and ancestors of Jesus in the pendentives. Not unlike what we've seen from Mantegna, using perspective and foreshortening to make those bodies look realistic. And look at what he's not doing. He doesn't have a continuation of a single horizon line, of a single space, as if it really is a picture window. Each bay, each section has its own perspective, its own horizons, its own ground lines. And in some cases, he has used grisaille, coming from the French for gray, where he has painted, particularly the boundaries between each panel, between each character, as if they are marble, as if they are stone, to enhance that look that Mantegna uses to divide up his composition in terms of a picture window. Michelangelo includes it in the picture. Again, he's thinking of everybody as sculpture. So here's creation of Adam. Again, strong classical body types for both Adam and God the Father. Maybe the one enigma is the swirling mass of drapery around God here, where this is typically understood as Eve, who is yet to be created, as if everybody else in the universe is under that canopy, swirling, floating in midair with the deity. You can see also, this is a quick technique. Fresco has to be done before the plaster dries. So what is most important here is the bodies. The background, the landscape, not important. So it gets a very brushy attention paid to it, like the upper left there. The most important are the two sides of the composition, Adam, the first man, and the deity on the right, which some people actually compare to the structure of the human brain, as if Michelangelo used that to inform the shape of the swirling mantle and the shape of all of the bodies floating along with God there. We've seen gods, goddesses depicted before. It's nothing new, like Venus by Botticelli. Yet, remember, there's a flatness, a cartooniness to Venus. She's elongated and graceful, distorted in a way that suits the goddess of love, that suits the poem that is Botticelli's source material. Michelangelo's source material is Genesis. It's the Torah, the very beginning of Judeo-Christian tradition. And yet, we have a very Zeus or Jupiter-like figure here on that right-hand side. Before, we haven't really gotten such a glimpse at, the white hair and beard of God as he might appear in pop culture these days. We haven't gotten the same glimpse of him in action. If you recall, we've seen him enthroned. We've seen him in very didactic, very theologically driven compositions like Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, which, by the way, Michelangelo once said, I believe, Jan van Eyck tries to do so much with his painting that he accomplishes nothing. Look at how many details, every bead, every glint of gold that Jan van Eyck renders in oil paint. It's the complete opposite in technique to how Michelangelo approaches fresco. Compare him to Titian. And we have, again, the bearded god up above the Virgin on the left-hand side. Not only is there a switch in compositional direction, where we have left-right in creation of Adam, and up and down in the Assumption of the Virgin, but Titian's use of color, that lovely gold, exemplifies the connection between divine and human. What's between divine and human on the Michelangelo side? Do we have any gold, any rays of light, even any halos? Nothing. Look between the index fingers, it's just space. So for Titian, he's using color to depict a very spiritual moment. For Michelangelo, the creation of Adam is physical, tactile, as if the touch of the two fingers has just happened. Now he exists, Adam, and now the fingers part. Too poetic? There were some mixed reviews of his ceiling work, and yet he comes back a couple decades later to finish Last Judgment, which is on the altar wall. So this is the New Testament. This is the idea of redemption that accompanies the creation of Adam and the original sin depicted above. We could think of it this way. The Pope at the time, which is a different Pope by now, might think about how difficult Michelangelo was, and yet he's an important weapon for the church to use in the Counter-Reformation. By now, Martin Luther has set Europe on fire in religious terms. There are people leaving the Catholic Church, forming new churches, and it's not just a matter of, okay, you go this way, I'll go that way. People are killing each other. People go to war over this. And we'll talk more about that with chapter 23, excuse me. So they look at, the cardinals and the Pope look at Michelangelo's terribilità, that sense of awe, that sense of might in his Pietà, in his Sistine Chapel, in his David. That's what they want. So what is a terribilità version of Jesus? It is a version of Jesus that, once again, has this classically muscular body. And by now, this is a mature Michelangelo style. This is not the David, which is slightly boyish. And this is not, of course, the creation of Adam with its simplicity that I've mentioned. This is complicated. The Last Judgment is from the book of Revelation. So Christ has returned to judge who will go to heaven and who will go to hell. The dead have risen down below, and those who are judged for heaven float upward. Those who are judged for hell actually go to the right. We see here the river Styx, we could say. We have the boatman, who's actually a demon swinging an oar at poor, unfortunate souls here. That is a standard division where we might have visually heaven on the left and hell on the right, because the idea is the good are on Jesus's right hand and the bad are on Jesus's left. Not so simple, though. We have that division left and right, and yet we also have top and bottom. All of this is the heavenly host. People come up from being judged worthy of paradise, as well as Christ himself. And this is the profane world that includes hell. Complicated enough? Let's zoom in. So here is what my professor described as Michelangelo's mature, beefy style. One good way of identifying a Michelangelo is if the bodies appear like they could win a wrestling match, you know, as if they're Olympic weightlifters, then it's a Michelangelo. And how terrible, how frightening that raised right hand must seem to those who believe in this judgment. Will they go to heaven or will they go to hell? And this is behind the altar. So this is a constant reminder of why Mass is said, why communion is taken in Catholic tradition. All around him are familiar faces, perhaps, Mary, and some unfamiliar ones holding their attributes. So we have saints holding their implements of martyrdom, the way they were executed. Poor Bartholomew here. Saint Bartholomew was flayed alive, so he holds his flayed skin along with a knife at Jesus's left hand there, left foot. It's said that that flayed skin is actually a distorted self-portrait of Michelangelo. So Last Judgment, just like the Pietà, has its roots way, way back in the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages. This is a 12th century example from France, where we have a central Christ, and again, arms gesturing left to heaven, right to hell. And at the bottom, we do have sort of those waiting judgment. So this is the earthly realm in the lower register or row. That is the standard. What's missing from Michelangelo's version are the halos, particularly the full body halo or mandorla surrounding Jesus. Jesus is also supported by angels and often personifications of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. An angel, an eagle, an ox, and a lion. That iconography here is set aside to where in place of a halo, we have a glowing aura, which in terms of trompe-l'oeil, fooling the eye into thinking this is a naturalistic scene, is perhaps much more successful. Instead of just a few very diagrammatic evangelists and saints and angels, we have an entire universe of classically formed people, where even the women appear like they could win an Olympic gold medal, no? The only thing that is at all fanciful are the demons below and the orange glow of hell on the lower right. And it does glow. The Last Judgment, the ceiling above, went through a major conservation, a major cleaning in the late 80s, early 90s. And scholars were just astonished by how much was on there. This is soot from fires, candle smoke, even other artists over the years, painting layers of varnish over top of it, revealing a glowing neon technicolor composition. So this is meant to be seen through the smoke of incense and candles in a time where electric light didn't exist. This was all planned to be very easily understood. This would be a reminder to those in the chapel, who often are clergy themselves, wouldn't necessarily need to be taught and told the stories of the Bible because they can read Latin, they can read the Bible, they've always been able to. Yet it underscores the humanist situation of the Bible. And for this and the Counter-Reformation, it underscores the importance of the Catholic Church and their understanding of how to get to heaven. The battle lines are clearly drawn then. Up here are the Catholics, down here, the Protestants. As architect, Michelangelo creates what is arguably the best example of Counter-Reformation, the new Basilica of St. Peter. But let's do a little background here. Architecture leading up to Michelangelo's work in Rome, like Bramante's Tempietto here, high Renaissance architecture focuses on the centrally planned chapel with Tuscan classical orders. So it is very Roman, it is very pagan, with the addition of domes thanks to Brunelleschi's influence. And by now, this is a style that doesn't need all of the color and pattern that we've seen before. This is a sculptural architecture of masses and volumes, that is, solids and voids, building and space. This particular place is the site of St. Peter's martyrdom, therefore it is a martyrium. This is where St. Peter is executed, crucified. The basilica is also a martyrium in that it is where he is entombed. You might notice or recognize this centrally planned architecture from Perugino's work. At the time, it was something that is very real, built by people like Bramante, and yet it is also a favorite fantasy of the artists from Perugino to Leonardo. This grand Roman domed chapel with very Brunelleschi-like porticos with arches over top the columns here. It was a thought exercise on the part of Leonardo in his notebooks. There are some buildings today attributed to designs like these. And you can recognize perhaps some churches even around Cleveland have aspects of this domed, centrally planned church type. This is not a new style even. It is unique though for Roman Italian artists to be considering it, because for centuries it has been about longitudinal churches. The Greek Orthodox Church has been building them this way, but not the Roman Catholic Church. So this is a bit of a switch, looking toward both the antique, the ancient Roman, and the Eastern, more exotic examples. So it's that playfulness with architectural style from Leonardo's notebooks, from Bramante's smaller scaled project, that New St. Peter's comes. Michelangelo essentially takes Bramante's plan for St. Peter's and adjusts it. He beefs it up in his own style. It is a Greek cross that we would expect to find in an Orthodox church, inscribed in a square. And we have, of course, repetition of circles, like the circle of the dome, and the smaller domes and vaults around it. So we have the Vitruvian man here, essentially. We have the mundane square and the sacred circle. He beefs it up by the thickness of the walls to support his dome, and he also scales it up so that inside we are dwarfed. Nothing is human scale, it is colossal in scale, with colossal Corinthian orders in pilasters and in columns in the front. So it's a very Roman, very ancient looking, very pagan looking plan here. And to underscore the beefiness, Bramante's on the left is delicate and lacy, and quite possibly engineering-wise would not have been able to hold the dome with these relatively tiny piers here. So just look at the change in scale from Bramante on the left to Michelangelo on the right. Proportionally, too, we have both a closing in of the structure to control just how much area the stone has to span, and to add to this overall sense of rationality and simplicity. Bramante's plan, as lacy and delicate as it looks, would actually be quite complex in terms of walking through it. Look at all of these different apses, these half-circle niches for chapels. Very useful in Catholic tradition. You could have chapels dedicated to particular saints, dedicated by particular families in Rome, as well as, of course, the high altar. But that's a lot of variation, a lot of variety, and not a lot of unity. It's the same with Jan van Eyck, trying to do so much that you accomplish very little. Michelangelo condenses, unifies, by taking away some of these lacy parts and creating that single square ambulatory where you can walk around the entire centrally domed area without being stopped by other niches or other walls. So this view from the side of St. Peter's, as it still exists today in Rome, is an example of both the colossal order and the sculptural philosophy of Michelangelo made into a building. At this distance, of course, the dome is hidden from us by the rest of the building, the body of the basilica. Yet we can see we have this lovely pattern of verticals broken by alternating window types, half circles and triangular pediments. We have a change in sharp corners versus rounded apses. So it is more than just walls. Everything is an opportunity for relief. That is a change in depth. That is an understanding of the moldability of the architecture on the part of the viewer. This is very different from Alberti, who was all about the numbers, right? Where his proportions are mapped out by the lovely Florentine gray stone and patterns here on Santa Maria Novella in Florence, where we have palazzos that are actually much more unified and rational than some of these early Quattrocento churches. like the Palazzo Farnese, which of course you might recall others like the Palazzo Rucellai that we looked at briefly. Inside, oh, sorry about the blue text. Hope that's not too hard to see. Inside we have evidence of Michelangelo essentially taking over. So we have alternation of, again, triangles and half circle pediments going from the Ionic level to the Corinthian level in terms of orders. A harmony in the horizontal as well as the vertical in that way. The difference, of course, there's a Colosseum if you need to remember why we have Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian on these three levels. If we leave it just separated like this, there's nothing to really unify the three levels on the outside. Here we have triangles and then half circle, triangle, half circle, triangle. That alternation is what provides some unity on the outside. And so that's probably the product of Michelangelo. And two, the jutting out of the entrance, which we haven't seen before if you look at Rucellai, adds that sculptural quality that we saw at St. Peter's to break up the monotony, right? And connect and jut past the horizontal lines and create vertical as well as horizontal unity. And if you're a fan of architecture and Michelangelo's not your guy, maybe Palladio is. Working in the realm of Venice, but many other places too, sought after, particularly for the centrally planned work that he's famous for, the Villa Rotonda. Now this is a private villa, yet he's also basically copied this plan for a church in Venice. The aspect here is a villa, which is the private country residence, as opposed to the palazzo, which is the city residence of a great family like the Medici, for instance. This is meant to create beautiful views of the landscape, the belvedere. So not this view looking at the building necessarily, but the view from this portico and that portico and the ones on the other two sides. That is what Palladio is essentially composing here. So unlike Raphael, who can use the pyramid, the circle to compose his work, Palladio has taken into account the landscape and the view from his porticos, the view from his very building. The central plan and the dome over the crossing, that's very church-like. Even the porches are very temple-like, using the Pantheon as a model. So here's the ancient Roman example that Palladio is most likely directly quoting, but in this case, much smaller scaled with that lovely red tile roof for residence as opposed to worship. We've talked about the Pantheon and Roman influence before with Brunelleschi's dome. So Palladio's not doing anything new, but do recognize that he's building, designing in a more high Renaissance way, as opposed to Brunelleschi in the Quattrocento, because we don't have any distractions of patterns and markings. It is the simplicity of pediment, these triangular sections here, orders, in this case Ionic, across each porch, and the unity of those four porticos centered on the dome. Inside, this is why it might not seem very conducive to living. Essentially, just like Michelangelo's St. Peter's, you can walk around the entire circumference of Villa Rotonda, room to room to room, without even going out into the hallway. part of this is just how people used to build houses, where one room leads to the next instead of all rooms off of a hallway. This would not be necessarily how a palazzo is designed, but he's essentially taken the body of the palazzo and condensed it, instead of around a square courtyard, around the circular domed atrium. That's what he essentially gives to San Giorgio Maggiore. Notice basically bare stone, bare marble. In true Roman form, all of this would be brightly colored and painted. Yet at the time, what they were digging up, what they were finding in ruins, the painting was worn off. So Palladio, as well as Michelangelo, they mistakenly understood Roman classical style to be bare marble. So here we have each Corinthian colossal order, engaged column, and pilaster, unadorned by any change in the color of the stone or any painting on top, any frescoes at all. Look at that ceiling. Compare it to Alberti's Sant'Andrea. The color, the light, the liveliness of both painting and tile work, different colored marble. In this case, Alberti is actually closer to true Rome, and Palladio's Cinquecento Mannerist work here is much more about Palladio than ancient Rome.